Welcome to Family Dynamics and Impact of Wealth. In a world where talking about the impact of money is difficult, we share stories and tips for reducing the negative impact that significant wealth can have on our emotions, relationships, and behaviors. Now here's your host, Ginny Galisano.
Welcome, everyone. Today we have with us Sally Sakin. Sally is a mother, a widow, and a seeker of wisdom. She is a woman who has led a life of constant transition to adjust to the current needs and demands of her family or community. While never intending for this to be her life path, Sally discovered and accepted that it was in this way that she could do the most good. Welcome, Sally.
Good morning.
Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Sally, your husband Craig passed away 4 years ago when he was 51 years old. At that time, your daughters were 22 and 20. What happens to a family when they lose a father when everyone is so young? And what are some of the critical issues you faced as a young widow?
Well, as you can imagine, everyone is in shock. It was an unexpected passing. And while Craig had gone into semi-retirement, he still was an active business person, and he was in the private equities business, a highly complicated business that took him investing pretty much all over the world, and he had been doing that since before our kids were born, and the investment strategies are long-term strategies. So while he was semi-retired, those investments were not completed. And he was in partnership with a number of other partners and limited partners, and those investments still, many of them are not completed. So besides the shock of losing your father and your spouse, there were many immediate business issues that needed to be taken care of that while I had heard him speak about them extensively, and he had gone into this business when it was just beginning in the 1980s. So he grew up in the business. So I learned quite a bit about it. I did not know about the specific investments.
Today, I know you manage the financial assets of your family's future because you've had to. Although I know that after Craig passed, you came to this painful awakening of what it meant to be head of your family's household from the financial and business perspective. If I understand you correctly, I believe the learning curve was steep for you. Can you tell us about that journey?
I can try.
Mm-hmm.
Because Craig had traveled so much, I had always referred to myself as a single mother. He wasn't crazy about my referring to myself that way, but I did because he wasn't around enough to actively participate in many of our family's decisions. So as his career thrived, he was so engrossed in those things that he often didn't have the patience or the time or, quite honestly, the energy to really think through some of the important family matters. And so essentially we just created a division of labor, and I took over the family matters. I wasn't happy about that, but it was in many ways just easier.
And how do you define family matters?
Well, maybe for our family, some of the decisions were different because my younger daughter was born with cerebral palsy, and that wasn't identified at her birth, but over the first 4 years of her life, she was quite ill, and she was needing lots of extra care and many hospital visits and doctor's appointments, and he wasn't there. So it wasn't as though I could wait for him to get back from a trip. She just needed care. And I had thought after she was born, maybe I would go back to work, but I just decided I can't do this. I can't leave her care in someone else's hands.
So your job became something different than you had originally intended. Not that mothers actually think of their motherhood as a job, but essentially it is what came to occupy your passion and your life and your focus.
Yes. Within the first 12 to 18 months of her life, I recognized that the medical community was not going to give me the support that I needed to get her diagnosed and to have her have all of the kinds of, let me just say, treatments that I thought would be needed. And I recognized that I was going to need to be a full-time advocate. And I saw advocacy way beyond just her needs because there just weren't services there. So Craig was on the road. I couldn't ask him to be involved. And many times decisions had to be made immediately in a doctor's office. Am I going to take her to a hospital or am I going to see what happens tonight? And he was in a meeting. I wasn't going to interrupt a meeting. I mean, I'm an independent thinker. And I think I'm fortunate that I'm an independent thinker. So I just took over those things. On top of which I had another child, and she needed to be nurtured, and she was scared. I was scared. So I had to step to the plate. Did I always do the right thing? I'm sure I didn't. But I just had to be there. So going back to my single mother statement, I just had to make a lot of decisions about what our family would do. And our family often was a 3-person family. And he would come home from road trips on a Friday night, and I would say, this is what we're doing. And he often didn't like it. And I would say, I'm sorry you don't like it, but do you want me to interrupt you? Do you want me to say you can't go on a business trip? Do you want this new industry that you're investing in to not have your attention? And he would say, well, I can't do that. My partners wouldn't appreciate it. And so I would say, then this is going to be how it's going to be because this is our family setup and we can't change that. And he came to accept that, sometimes begrudgingly, but he did. So we had this division of labor. And as his partnership thrived, he gained material wealth slowly and then not so slowly. And so he also wanted things. So he wanted, a bigger house or horses or, a whole variety of things. Well, he wasn't around to manage those things. So it became my responsibility to manage those things. And again, I think sometimes he didn't like it. I know often he didn't like it, but I would say, if you're going to purchase these things and you want me to be part of it, I'm the decision maker.
So I know one of the things you've spoken about around the whole concept of spending money is I know that you and Craig did not always see eye to eye on how to spend money on the kids, for instance. So when you are at this upwardly mobile family, how did you compromise and instill good values around wealth and money on your children, especially when you and Craig's values and views were so different?
Well, if it's okay, I'd like to just step back a minute. I think our values and views were different because we came from different kinds of backgrounds. We had a lot of discussions about that, and they were honest discussions. And I think Craig became very close with my family, and he appreciated the values that I was raised with because I came from a family that did have some money, and he did not. So the first value that we agreed on was education. And so our older daughter, we had moved to the community we moved to. Again, let me step back. My background was in urban planning, and we had moved out of the city, New York City. My father would say, what city? We moved out of New York City, and actually we didn't live in New York City. We lived in the 6th borough, Hoboken. And when he joined a group of partners that were in Greenwich, Connecticut, and I didn't want to live in Greenwich, so we lived in northern Westchester. And my older daughter, I had chosen a specific community because it was diverse. And my older daughter started in the public school system. I very much wanted her in the public school system. And the school wasn't working out for her. And I went to Craig and I said, there's something wrong. And I think she's having problems. And I'm not going to watch my child suffer this way. I want to put her in private school. And he was stunned. And he said, you know, you fought for us to be in this community. You wanted a diverse community, blah, blah, blah. And I said, I recognize that, but how was I going to know that the school really wasn't going to work out for her? So he agreed with me, and we put her in a private school. And that turned out to be a very good decision. At the time, we didn't quite have enough money to pay for it, so my parents assisted us. I think that was very difficult for him to ask for the help. Well, he didn't ask for the help. I asked for the help, but he wasn't happy about it. Within a few years, we didn't need the help. And then our younger daughter couldn't go to private school because she required so many intervention services. And so she had to go to the public school. And Craig wasn't involved in understanding all of the processes that go along with that. But I recognized that I had to be very heavily engaged with the school district. So then we had a lot of discussions about, okay, what could we pay for services for her? And if she was going to get these services and I had to be involved, then, you know, where was our older daughter going to be? And who was going to be helping her? So we had a nanny. I didn't want my older daughter to be carted around by a nanny. So I wouldn't have a driving nanny, which he thought was ridiculous. But if I was not going to be a paid working professional, I was going to be engaged in every part of my kids' lives. And I wasn't typical of the upper middle class mother. You know, many of them, they would have been very happy to have a nanny carting their kid around.
Right.
So we had lots of discussions about those kinds of things. And then when you have a kid in a private school and the other kids, they have, I don't know, today's trendy clothes. I didn't think that was necessary, but I thought other things were necessary. So we had physical therapists who came to the house. And if a physical therapist was going to come to the house and work with my younger daughter, I wanted my older daughter to have one-on-one things. So I tried to balance and talk to him about balancing, well, if this one's going to have one-on-one attention and the other one, maybe she would like some one-on-one attention.
So Sally, I'm just curious, how do you think this impacted your children's perception of money and wealth now that they're adults?
I think it impacted each of them differently. My older daughter, in many ways, I think any sibling of a sibling with disabilities or a sibling with major medical issues struggles to either try to be perfect or not be perfect, does things to try and gain attention. My older daughter did everything she could to be the good girl. Of course, children don't see these dynamics. So she didn't want to complain and she didn't want to ask for things. I think, and I don't want to put words in her mouth, but I think that as she got older, she recognized that she just couldn't get the same kind of attention because her sister was sick. And that was troublesome for her, as an adolescent in particular. Today, at 27, I think she can reflect on it much more maturely and understands that her sister needed it. And while she tried so hard to actively engage and be helpful, she didn't know what to do. And that we as her parents tried to give her as much as we could without spoiling her. But she wanted to be spoiled.
Of course.
Her sister subconsciously was completely the opposite. She didn't want the attention. She wanted to be completely, quote unquote, normal. And she denied her problems. So she manipulated and took advantage of the adult attention, but she didn't want it. So let me try and give you an example. At one point, one of them was maybe 8 and the other was 5 or 6. We moved to the community right next door because Craig really wanted to move to Colorado and he couldn't because of his business. So we moved to the community right next door, which was a little bit more rural and open, onto a horse farm. And my older daughter loved horses. My younger daughter was in hippotherapy, which is riding for her physical needs. My husband bought my older daughter a horse, and she loved to ride, so he thought that was a good decision. He didn't let her choose the horse. My younger daughter didn't want to have to ride therapeutically, so she wanted her own horse. My older daughter was mad because she didn't get to choose the horse, so she didn't want to ride anymore. If you looked at it from the outside, most people would say, look at these lucky kids. But there was all kinds of internal strife going on around it. And Craig was baffled by the whole thing. He didn't understand that going to therapeutic riding was not fun. And he didn't understand because as a kid, he loved riding, and then his parents couldn't let him ride anymore. So he was like, well, what kid doesn't want a horse?
Sure, and I'm sure that for Lauren, not being able to pick out the horse and have a choice in it had everything to do with a sense of independence, adulthood,
Correct.
Respect, all of that.
Right. So she just stopped riding. So on the one hand, he was spoiling her, and on the other hand, he wasn't allowing her to grow up. And so we had constant decisions like this. May I give you another example?
Sure.
So traveling was something that I thought was really important for kids. So Craig and I would go back and forth. One year I planned a trip for President's Weekend to Mexico. And he said, why Mexico? And I said, well, Lauren's studying Mexico in social studies. So he said, well, every year when they're studying a certain country, do we have to go there? And I said, well, it would be a good idea. He couldn't really believe that. But traveling with Arden was very difficult because she had either a wheelchair or a motorized scooter and all kinds of special needs. It was a lot of work. So Craig traveled all the time. He wasn't excited about traveling. He wanted to be home. So I wanted to do things so that he wanted to do those things with us on vacation. So we sort of settled and we bought a house at the beach, and we could go there in the summertime, and he loved the beach. And then we could have everything that Arden needed. And
already there.
And it made it easy. And also I could get therapists and whatever and know them. And then later on, as I said, Craig loved Colorado. We bought a house in Colorado. So we had 3 homes so that we could do these family things together, and it was easier. But how many families have 3 homes and a corporate jet they can fly on and, bring their friends with them? But we didn't travel to foreign countries. We did this because it was easier for our family. I could set up adaptive ski lessons. I could set up whatever it was, know the people, get to know the community, be engaged, and have our family together.
You're listening to Family Dynamics and Impact of Wealth. If you're enjoying this podcast, please consider helping us out by telling a friend and leaving a review on iTunes, Google Play, or Stitcher. For more information, visit our website, dynamicsoffamilywealth.com. And now back to the show.
So now I want to jump ahead or to another part of your life. Around the time when I actually got to know you, and this was probably not quite a year after Craig had passed, and you are now dealing with all of these advisors and trying to weed your way through the financial business side of your partnership, which you knew nothing about. And earlier we had mentioned that it was a steep learning curve for you. Tell us about that journey.
Well, I think it's pretty clear that I take the bull by the horns. I knew that Craig wasn't healthy, but I didn't know he was going to die. I knew that Craig had left his partnership, but I didn't know that things in the partnership had gone sour. I knew the two lead managing partners, but obviously I didn't know the ins and outs and the intricacies of that business and what had to happen. I just, assumed. I wrote them an email from the hospital and said, Craig is on a ventilator. When the ventilator comes out, he won't make it. I assumed that they would write me and say, what can we do? That's not what I got.
Did you get anything or silence?
After he passed, I got a phone call. No one came to his funeral. And then I got a phone call, and my recollection is fuzzy. So if I don't get it right, I apologize to anyone who I may offend. But my recollection is that there was a limited period of time where they had to make me an offer based on regulations for all of Craig's outstanding ownership investments. And they couldn't buy it out. They didn't have the cash to buy it out. So there was one piece that Craig had negotiated with them in November, and he passed away in February. They wanted that piece back. And that piece he had sold to them. It was his management share in the business. And they had, in exchange for that, they wanted that piece so that they could bring in new partners, new managing directors. And they wanted that piece back, which I understood. But he had essentially sold that to them for a percentage of a new fund. And they told me the new fund had no value. And I knew that they had raised more money than they had ever previously raised. So to me, it had value. And they said, well, we haven't invested it yet, so it had no value. And I said to them, so Craig helped you grow this business, and he passed away, and you're going to tell me that his management share, which he just sold back to you, is valueless now. And they said, yes. And I said, I won't accept that.
Wow. So suddenly, in the midst of grieving and figuring out what this new life was like, you had to suddenly become a negotiator, a business manager, an analyst.
Well, and on top of that, I also had to recognize that he didn't have a relationship with his partners, that if he did, it wouldn't have just come down to fighting for the monetary value of that percentages for their limited partners. They would have, if he had that relationship, they would have gone back to the limited partners and said, this widow deserves this. We need to work something out. And they were completely unwilling to do that. And that was painful. So, yes, I had to do all the things you mentioned, but the pain of recognition that he was somehow not respected enough, that was horrible. And so from there, what I also had to realize is that I didn't have anyone I could lean on. If I couldn't lean on the partners, who was I going to lean on? On top of that, Ginny, because Craig had worked with so many lawyers and so many accountants and so many professionals, we did not have personal professionals who worked with us. We flipped from this person to this person to this person. Oh, don't worry, Sally, I'll get it handled. So I didn't have a family lawyer to go to. I didn't have these longtime people to work with. When we did an estate plan, it had been, 5 or 6 years earlier. And it was some person who was recommended by another person who I had met once in our living room and never saw again. Craig didn't want to deal with administrative things. He was an entrepreneur. He was not a planner.
You know what's interesting for me is you're talking about this. As you know, I deal with wealth from a lot of different perspectives. One organization tells me that I refer to them as a human, social, spiritual, intellectual capitals, and another organization refers to it as different dimensions of wealth, and relationships are one of those dimensions of wealth. And what I'm getting from you is that clearly, as an entrepreneur, what Craig was so focused on was the financial capital and not necessarily paying much attention to the cultivation or the development of the human side or the human dimension of wealth or even the relationship dimension of wealth.
Yeah, well, in part because of his work lifestyle. We didn't have discussions about family ethics, family values. I mean, I did try, but those weren't things that he was particularly interested in. He wanted to accumulate wealth. He came from nothing. That was his way to prove to the world he was something. I understood that, but he didn't have these role models that I grew up with. These kinds of role models. I didn't always agree with them, but my family had discussed these kinds of things and his family didn't. So, I had my girls doing volunteer work when they were 4 or 5 years old to give back to the community. He sort of thought it was crazy. All right, if you want them to do that, fine. But he didn't understand why that was important. So there was nothing for me to stand on. And I didn't understand finance. I had always said to him, Craig, let's have a budget. We don't need a budget. So finally, what I said to him is, okay, let's have separate accounts. You put into our checking account X, and I won't spend more than it. And if I need to spend more than it for medical purposes, I'll go into our savings account because I'm not going to not spend on medical when we have the money. And we'll agree on what we can spend on vacations or gifts. So I never overspent what was in the checking account. That was my budget. But we never talked about budgeting.
So do you want to talk just a little bit about that next stage of really, I feel like you really became quite empowered and quite knowledgeable about finances, learning how to weed out the good advisors versus the bad advisors. Maybe bad is the wrong word, but the ones who weren't helpful to you.
It's taken me a long time. I mean, I'm almost 4.5 years. A lot of people pulled the rug out from under me. A lot of people that I thought wouldn't pull the rug out from under me. I intrinsically trust people. I think that's a good quality, but I guess in business it's not a good quality. Also, I want to have relationships with the people who are the professionals around me. I don't just want to go in and get whatever it is done. I want to know them. I want them to know me. And I know that that's not how most people operate, but that's how I'm going to operate. So I guess I trusted people who seemed to want to know me. Then that was a bad decision, but I didn't recognize it. But one other thing I guess I should add. At the same time that Craig passed away, my younger daughter's physical and medical disabilities had turned also into mental health disabilities. So I was trying to find mental health services for her, not really understanding what her mental health issues were. And for listeners out there, we have a deficit of understanding about mental health issues, deficit of understanding about how physical and medical conditions tend to lead to mental health issues. And I was not getting any real guidance around that. I had one dear friend who's a psychiatrist, who lived in the Asking community, who was incredibly helpful, but finding placements for my daughter was very, very difficult, plus she was resisting it. So my job had always been caring for the family and our material thing. So I was drinking from a fire hose. And look, my dad had done my tax returns until Craig started to do them. So shame on me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I hadn't learned it And I would say to anyone out there, if you don't have to do your own tax returns, but at least understand what they are. I still don't completely understand them because I file 7 of them. It's crazy. But at any rate, the IRS doesn't understand them because yesterday they said, put them in 2099 or something like that. So at any rate, it took me a long time. Part of it was because I thought that I should have a bank help me, and I never really got clear definition from the bank on what they would then do with the assets. And as it turned out, the bank refused to allow me to manage the assets. And to this day, I believe the bank was wrong about that. I've been told by many people the bank was wrong about that. The bank stands by their opinion.
And consequently, you're no longer with them.
Correct. But the bank said that that's how Craig's will read. And so it's how they interpreted it. Well, of course they interpreted it that way because they wanted the control. So lots of things were being done that I didn't have the capacity to necessarily fight because I needed things handled for me. And I didn't understand how the fee structures worked. I didn't understand that I was told I needed wealth management advice. I paid an extra fee for that. As I started to get that, after the second year, I realized, well, this isn't really doing me much good. And why am I paying fees for this? And why isn't it part of my estate planning fee? But it took me a while to put these pieces together because I had no background or experience.
Yeah.
And I had no one else advising me, telling me, you don't need this.
Or even to help you figure out what questions to ask.
Exactly. So the only person that I had working with me was an accountant who had worked with us for a long time. But he just kept saying, you'll sort these things out over time. It takes time to do this. He did the taxes, but not estate taxes. So I needed the bank to do them. And the reason why the bank was doing them was because I had convinced Craig several months before he passed away that we needed a new estate plan. And he had just given them all of the information on our assets. So they had the information. I thought it was complicated and convoluted information that they were evaluating. For me to try and get that back from them and find someone else, and they also were our brokers, that was a huge task. And they said to us, we don't even understand everything that's here. We're bringing in specialists to evaluate it.
And how much did all of that cost?
Right. So at least I had it all in one place with a group that technically should have been quite reliable. So as I began to learn that I wasn't getting what I needed, I began to question it. But I needed the estate taxes done, and it was in their hands. I had a really good estate attorney that I found within 15 days. That was pretty good.
Wow.
And she's quite well respected. So I think that if I can say anything else about myself, I have to accept what has happened, and I have to forgive myself because I just didn't know any better. And I'm a lot smarter today.
Yes. So, Sally, today, like many people, especially women, I know you have wondered how to define yourself in a world where titles are important and definitive. Personally, I see you as a model for crisis management and a master juggler of life. At this moment in time, how do you answer that question? Who are you and what do you do?
I think I'm like a lot of people. They just don't necessarily say it. I'm just trying to find out what I want to be when I grow up.
Yeah.
I think life is, in our generation, a series of transitions. And the more you can accept the transitions, the easier things will go. So a lot of people would say that I've had more than my fair share of unfortunate circumstances. There was a time where I would agree with them, but I'm just back from a trip to India. And it's really, I planned that trip as a demarcation point for myself. the before and the after. I needed to set a time where I was going to say, okay, I'm moving forward. And I think that I can reflect and say that transition's good. And yeah, everybody's got laundry. Everybody's got difficult things that they've either had to have dealt with or they deal with all the time. But you learn from them and you grow from them and you do the best you can with them. Nothing's ever perfect, even if you're A-type like me. And if you can find a way to just accept what is and try and live for today and understand that you'll make mistakes and try to then grow from them, then your transitions are going to be easier.
So, you may have already answered this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway.
Okay.
Your story of being a financially and uninformed widow is so familiar to too many women, way too many women. I like to leave our listeners with a small or a big action step that they can take and implement on their own. Is there a last word of wisdom you'd like to share?
Yeah, if there were things that I woulda, shoulda, coulda, it would be that I insisted on, as Craig's material wealth grew, that I insisted on an estate attorney I helped to choose and that we met with on an annual basis, because that estate attorney would have advised us on how important many steps that I've done in the past 4 years would have been for us to do previously. And I would have been involved in them because Craig didn't have the time to do them. So I would have needed to have been involved with them. And I would have known a lot more. And I think an estate attorney is if you have some degree of wealth, that's the person who's going to give you the guidance if you find the right one. And I will be updating that estate plan probably every couple of years from now on. It's not something that is a final document.
So my experience so far is that with estate attorneys and accountants and financial advisors, that they really are much more focused on that financial side of wealth. Earlier we talked about the fact that Craig had not done much to cultivate the other dimensions of wealth.
So let me address that if you don't mind. So you asked for one, but there's two other pieces that I would suggest. I would suggest for any family, doesn't matter your wealth, even maybe before you have kids, come up with a value code. So I sat down with you and my older daughter, and Ginny, you helped us develop. I had done it first, took a dry run at myself, but you helped us develop a family moral code. And that family moral code, it can be broad. I mean, it included, loving our pets and making sure they had a full life. But live by it. Put it on your refrigerator door. Let your kids know that these aren't rules. These are ethics. We have ethics and morals that we believe in, and they apply across the board. And they will apply to how you use your finances as well. They may not appear to, but they do. So I think that is really important. Some people may be part of a religion that helps them do that, but get someone to help you do that. Ginny can help you.
Thank you.
And the other thing that, for me, that has been the most important in the most recent, I'm not coming up with the right words, but in the past couple of years, what has been the most helpful is that I found a family office. And so now they are helping me with everything I can think of. I mean, I wanted to reevaluate my insurance. I wanted to have our properties managed in a certain way. I wanted to, I'm the guardian for my daughter. I wanted to make sure that everything was being given to the courts in the same manner annually. And they helped me coordinate everything. They helped me manage an annual schedule for not just financial issues, but family issues. I said I went to India. They took care of everything you can think of while I was gone. So if you can find a family office, if your life is that complicated, they can be astoundingly helpful.
So, Sally, thank you very much. You have been incredibly vulnerable as to share your story and your wisdom, which I know many are going to find so meaningful and personal. Thank you.
Thank you.
And for all of our listeners, I look forward to being with you again during our next podcast. Until then.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Family Dynamics and Impact of Wealth. Once again, if you've been enjoying this podcast, please consider leaving us a review wherever you listen to podcasts, and tell a friend you think might be interested in hearing these stories. For more information on the podcast or guidance for having more meaningful conversations around inherited or sudden wealth, please visit our website at dynamicsoffamilywealth.com.